Late 1940, and a German U-boat crew has just been fished out of the frigid North Atlantic. Their submarine lies somewhere on the ocean floor, and now they're crammed into the hold of a British destroyer. Soaked, shivering, and terrified. They'd been told stories, propaganda broadcasts that painted British captives as ruthless, vengeful, ready to exact revenge for every bomb that fell on London. So when they finally stumbled onto British soil, herded into camps surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers, they're bracing for the worst. What they got instead was something they couldn't possibly have anticipated. Confusion wrapped in newspaper, served every Friday at 6 o'clock sharp. The first POW camps established in Britain during 1940 were hastily constructed affairs, often repurposed from old military barracks or country estates requisitioned for the war effort. By mid-1941, Britain held approximately 1,500 German prisoners, a number that would swell to over 400,000 by war's end. These men arrived with preconceptions shaped by Dr. Goebbels' propaganda machine. Expect torture, expect starvation, expect humiliation. The Nazi propaganda ministry had spent years conditioning German soldiers to fear capture, circulating horror stories of Allied brutality. So when these prisoners shuffled through camp gates and were handed tin plates and told to queue for meals, many assumed this was theater, a temporary facade before the real punishment began. Camp routines were established quickly. Roll call at dawn, work details during the day, lights out at 10. The British Guards, many of them older men from the Home Guard or soldiers deemed unfit for frontline service, maintained discipline without the cruelty these Germans expected. But it was the food that became the first real test of these prisoners' assumptions. Meals arrived on schedule, portions measured according to international Red Cross guidelines, which Britain took seriously even as its own civilian population endured rationing. The Germans watched, waited, and wondered when the other shoe would drop. Then Friday came around. That first Friday in camp, something changed in the atmosphere. Guards who'd been stern all week suddenly seemed almost cheerful. The usual kitchen smells of boiled vegetables and weak tea were replaced by something entirely different. Hot oil, salt, vinegar cutting through the air. Prisoners noticed the guards gathering near the kitchen camp with an enthusiasm they'd never shown for Monday's mutton stew. Some guards were actually smiling, joking with each other. And when the food finally emerged, it came wrapped in old newspapers, greasy ink smudging onto fingers. The Germans looked at these parcels with deep suspicion. Whatever punishment the British had been planning, it was apparently starting now. The human mind under stress searches for patterns, especially threatening ones. German POWs arriving in British camps carried mental frameworks built by years of Nazi indoctrination about enemy barbarism. The propaganda had been specific and relentless. Goebbels' ministry distributed pamphlets to Wehrmacht soldiers throughout 1939 and 1940 depicting Allied forces as sadistic, particularly toward prisoners. One widely circulated leaflet claimed British camps used starvation as official policy, that captives were fed animal feed mixed with sawdust. Another suggested prisoners were subjected to scientific experiments involving deliberate malnutrition. These weren't random scare tactics. They were designed to make German soldiers fight harder, surrender less, and, if captured, interpret everything through a lens of victimhood and suspicion. When these men encountered actual British rations, their interpretation was predictable. The food wasn't familiar, therefore it must be substandard. It wasn't German, therefore it must be punishment. This cognitive bias had historical precedent. During World War I, German POWs in Britain had indeed suffered, not from deliberate cruelty, but from the U-boat blockade that starved Britain itself. By 1917, both captives and captors were malnourished. That generational memory lingered, passed down through families and military culture. Older Wehrmacht soldiers in 1940 sometimes had fathers who'd been British prisoners in the previous war. And those fathers' stories shaped expectations. But there was another layer. The German military's own treatment of prisoners created a psychological mirror. By 1941, conditions in German POW camps, particularly those holding Soviet prisoners, were catastrophic. Starvation was policy. Of the 5.7 million Soviet POWs captured by Germany, approximately 3.3 million died in captivity, many from deliberate neglect and hunger. German soldiers knew this, even if they didn't discuss it openly. It created an unconscious assumption. If we treat prisoners this way, surely the enemy does worse. Projection became expectation. The British food these Germans encountered seemed to confirm their worst fears, but for completely wrong reasons. Wartime rationing had transformed British cuisine into something unrecognizable even to the British themselves. By 1942, butter was limited to 2 ounces per person per week, meat to 1 shilling's worth, sugar to 8 ounces. The Ministry of Food pushed recipes using powdered eggs, dried milk, and vegetables grown in every available garden as part of the Dig for Victory campaign. What the German prisoners were eating wasn't punishment rations, it was the same food British families ate, sometimes better, because the Geneva Convention mandated POWs receive adequate nutrition. Yet the Germans couldn't see it that way. The boiled cabbage, the reconstituted potato, the bread that tasted slightly off because it was stretched with oat flour, all of it seemed designed to demoralize. They were waiting for the cruelty to escalate, for the masks to drop. They didn't realize the British were simply feeding them British food, prepared the British way under British wartime restrictions. The real shock was still coming, wrapped in yesterday's newspaper, smelling of malt vinegar and the sea. The morning meals set the tone. Porridge that resembled gray paste, tea strong enough to strip paint, bread that crumbled like sawdust. One Luftwaffe pilot, Klaus Hartmann, wrote in his diary that the breakfast looked like something scraped from a stable floor. The German prisoners sat in mesh halls with their tin plates poking at food that seemed intentionally designed to break spirits. They weren't entirely wrong about the quality. British wartime cooking had become legendarily grim, but they were wrong about the intent. Lunch brought boiled vegetables. Lots of boiled vegetables. Carrots, turnips, parsnips, cabbage, all boiled into submission until they surrendered any pretense of flavor or texture. The British cook staff, often local women volunteers, followed Ministry of Food guidelines religiously. Overcooked vegetables were considered safer, more digestible, patriotic even. One recipe card from 1941 suggested boiling cabbage for 25 minutes. 25 minutes! The Germans, accustomed to sauerkraut with actual tang and structure, stared at these pale, limp vegetables and saw confirmation of malicious intent. Some prisoners initially refused to eat, convinced the food was tainted or deliberately spoiled. Then came the truly bewildering items. Spotted Dick appeared on the menu in October 1940 at Camp 100 Tanks in Lanarkshire,